Hey there, so now with this video we turn to the moral ideas of the text so these are your tools, these are your analytical tools, these are your kind of solutions to the problem, right? And the problem most fundamentally is technocracy versus agency, right? So agency is my capacity to affirm the direction of my life, and technocracy is the way in which very powerful property owners who own the technologies feeding the mythology of transhumanism and posthumanism, right? The way that they are in charge, right? So that's the tension, right? And so which businesses feed into technocracy and which businesses feed into agency? Um, the text tends to call, as well as calling it agency, the text calls it vocation. And it identifies three fundamental categories of agency or vocation. These are time, space, and community or family. Okay? Uh, what I'll go through now are some of the examples, right? These are just pointers, right? But some of the examples that the text offers for the kind of the values, the moral values that kind of coordinate agency. So if we take time, so it says you want to pay, right? So the problem about the technologies, the radical, right? Radical goes to the question of roots, right? These radical technologies are challenging your roots. They are severing you from your roots or severing you from your inheritance. And now the question is, what is your inheritance, right? So if you think about something like each of us has a family history. Now, the reason that the document affirms development is that sometimes these family histories can be problematic. Right? I mean, some of you might have family stories, right, where your families have been problematic in some way. Think about when you go to a doctor, right, and the doctor always wants to know what is your family history, in terms of health and medicine, and some, have very difficult family histories, right? So this is why development is important and technology is important. But when the technology literally severs you and suggests a fresh creation, that's where you start to get the break with your inheritance, right? So most basically, the text is suggesting that you and I are happier and more developed where we are in a posture of reception or a posture of deference to our inheritance, right? The long legacy of the persons in our families who have contributed to where we are at, right? We all of us depend upon these inheritances, right? So, I mean, like the house that I'm living in, my house is an ordinary row home in Baltimore, but it's existed for about 120 years, right? So that's got nothing to do with me, right? That's to do with the people that I have inherited, their labor, their stewardship, has bequeathed to me. I mean, I had to pay for it, right? But it's bequeathed to me, right? A place to live, right? A home, right? So, one of these coordinates, right, is our family inheritance, okay? And then just to broaden that idea of family out, right? You and I have all inherited a civilizational identity. For the most part, we are the recipients of, or the bearers of, the inheritors of the Western way of thinking about life. We all of us are built from our memories, right? This is the trauma, right, of obviously things like dementia. When the person who gets dementia, as their memories erode, there's a real sense in which their personhood is eroding as well, right? So this idea, the document is suggesting that a worthy life, a life of agency, heavily depends upon the past, whereas transhumanism, post-humanism, right, it's a promise about the future, right? So this is the kind of fundamental sort of dynamics. And then there is the place where the church speaks, of course, about the future is a future after death. And although some of you might not think there's any kind of life after death, our civilizations do think that. Take even contemporary China, right, which is formally a communist, secular, materialistic, technological civilization. Basic to China to this day is, of course, the cult of the ancestors. Any of you ever seen that? I think it's maybe a Disney movie, Mulan, right? And the whole story, right, of the ancestors, right, where the Eddie Murphy character plays her ancestor, right, and encourages her to take up what? To take up the heritage of her samurai family, right? This is very, very actually the document, right? So we have these legacy stories that very much speak to the document, right? So the point about Mulan, right, is that she's not post-human. It's that she's like her ancestors. Okay. Now we come to the question not so much of time, but to the question of space. So, human agency depends upon home. I mean, think about the fact that when you have a home, you have a place of agency. This is different than like living on the streets, right? I mean, people who live on the streets, they don't have agency. They're constantly under threat. They have no security. Right? I mean, part of the problem of homelessness is the horrible victimization that happens so often for people who live on the streets. Comparably, think about migrants, right? Why does, for example, the church speak so profoundly towards the migrant problem and want it kind of resolved? Is because migrants suffer horribly. They're easy targets, easy marks. They're easy to victimize. So this idea of home is very critical, right? And the thing about transhumanism and posthumanism, it kind of tears up that idea of being at home, right? It suggests a radicalization of that idea, a new adventure into untold possibilities, right? Think also then, as well as home, we have our citizenship, and again, that goes to the migration problem, right? But think about the way in which you and I, as experiencing citizenship, experiencing the agency of some control over the political circumstances, is very much tied to place, to home, right? Because compare, for example, what happens when you're in an airport, right? Airports are very strange and interesting places, right? Because on the one hand, airports the world over, they're pretty much the same, right? But they're also super high security zones where, you enter into a system and that system is sort of dictating how you progress. right? I mean, if you kind of step out of line in an airport, yeah, you're going to find out about it real fast, because those are the most, how to say, surveilled and controlled environments, probably in the modern developed world, right? So you have that idea of citizenship that seems to be, I mean, is it more or less correct to think of transhumanism or posthumanism as something like living in an airport? And of course, well, who's then in control of the airport? Well, it's the companies that own the technologies, right? Um, the idea then that the church, the Vatican document talks a lot about then is right, a right appropriation to geography and to other things like land, thresholds, um, border encounters, right? So think about how also many of you like to go to the beach, right? The encounter between the land and the sea, or maybe some of you like to go to the mountains instead, right? But again, I mean, the threshold between being on the land and then going up the mountain. And I mean, just think about that in the way, for those of you who know, a little bit about the Bible, right? You think about all the biblical stories about mountains, being on mountains, going up mountains, coming down from mountains, right? There's all the sort of thing going on, and these are sort of threshold experiences, and so this idea, and of course for you and I, this has been made very familiar to us through sort of environmental questions, our encounters with nature. Think about what most, not all holidays, but many holidays are something like getting back to nature, visiting the great big American state parks, maybe going off to a mountain property or certainly a beach property, right, where you encounter nature as sea. Now, I know there are different kinds of holidays. I go up to New York or down into Miami or something like that, right? But for the most part, a lot of tourism is leaving the city and going off into the cosmos, so to say, right, or the natural. So that's the role of space, right? So there are different ways that our businesses, I mean, the businesses most engaged with our three topics, engage this problem of space. And you would want to think about that, right? So let's say you're doing the Megan movies, right? It's very interesting that Megan is a robot in the home. And of course, in the Megan 2, it's very interesting, right? That when she's first encountered again, right? Because per Megan 1, first film, there's this sense that she's destroyed. But of course, she's encountered again, right? Because she's in the circuitry of the house, right? And she's hovering like a ghost in the sort of the technological lineaments, fibers of the heating system, right? The digital heating system, so never mind just the computers, right? But the smart home, right, with all of these ways in which sort of technological worms can kind of move through these conduits, right? So just to say, right, that you want to be thinking about the idea of place in well, whichever of the three that you take up, right? I mean, the Bakuna, is very linked to place, right? It's linked to Central and Latin America primarily, Texas, Arizona, and of course it migrates. It migrates through social media, right? So again, you can think about place and migratory patterns and what have you. Okay, and then finally, there's this question of community, and the text deals to a degree politically with this idea, right? So community as opposed to strict populism, right? Nationalism, but also against globalization, globalism, right? So thinking of oneself as merely an international being, right? It really wants to always kind of bring it back to this idea of time and space and the coordinates of time and space in an inherited community. So what do you see about what it is important about community? Well, you have the idea of belonging, right? I mean, if you engage in post or transhumanism, what you're really doing, right, is snapping a connective cord with where you belong. Traditions, bonds, right? Isn't that the famous? Is that the Gettysburg Address, right? The mystic chords of memory, or something like that, right? Where Lincoln tries to pick up on the idea that the North and the South are actually kind of bonded together, and that's what's so horrifying about the Civil War. And you then think about piety, filial piety, right? So prominent. For those of you who know a little bit about the ancient Greeks, right? Your Homer and all that, right? They're always really invested in this question of love of home. You might, for those of you who remember the problem of Socrates and his death, right? He could have run away, right? Or could have run away from Athens. But the problem then would be that when you ran away from your home city, you would of course be separated from your friends, and therefore you would not get a burial, and you'd be left open for the animals to eat upon your death. And this preys on Socrates' mind, right? Because he knows he's been unjustly found guilty, but he nonetheless undergoes the punishment despite his friends saying, "Don't, let's run, let's get out of town," right? But he's like, no, because what happens then with the funeral rites and such like. So the other thing then, it kind of goes to this example from the life of Socrates that some of you might be familiar with. You've got the customs, manners of life, right? The way in which you and I, even in the way in which obviously language is an inheritance, it's specific to a culture, a civilization. Things like accents, ways even of moving the face are highly mannered, right? Think about, for example, the difference, say, between Western opera and Chinese opera, right? I mean, the faces and the costumes and the way of moving the body is completely different, right? So we have this customs and manners of life, which again is completely sort of framed by our inheritance. And then think even of our great holidays. Christmas, Easter, in the American context, of course, the 4th of July, right? The 4th of July couldn't be any more historically marked than, but I mean, even Christmas, obviously, Christmas is linked, to the birth of Jesus, Easter to the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? So, I mean, all these great holidays, Thanksgiving, of course, right? The encounter of the Westerners with the native population of this country, and so it goes on, right? So think about even the kind of the high points that we celebrate as the great moments, the great punctuating moments of a life, or even then, well, another example, of course, would be marriage. Probably for those of you who get married, right, probably the greatest party you'll ever throw, and of course that's linked to all manner of traditions. Of course, there are new versions of marriage now, but even those new versions tend not to depart radically from even the more sort of traditional versions, in that there's a dress code, there's a way of the ordering of the speeches at the wedding, or what gets drunk I mean, it'd be bizarre if you offer people Pepsi Cola instead of champagne. I mean, that would just be so bizarre. everyone would complain, probably leave. So I mean, even the more sort of like out there kind of versions of a marriage ceremony, nonetheless, have this, to use link the mystic chords of memory concept, right? And then the other thing I'm just going to close with this, right? The other thing that I suppose transhumanism and posthumanism threaten, and that the church is worried about, right, is pathos, is the collective traumas, collective sufferings. So, I mean, think about. I mean, this will probably not resonate so much with you, but I mean, if you've ever gone to any European country like France or Germany, England, right, you see all these war memorials. I mean, there are war memorials in Washington, D.C., right, the Vietnam War and what have you, right, that were sort of traumatic for the American psyche. And you obviously you see that around the First World War, the Second World War. Maybe if you come from Russia, very very famously the famous war memorial for the Patriotic War. So this is not unimportant, is it, to our identity and this participation in shared sufferings. And this is what transhumanism and posthumanism maybe wants to leave behind. But then, what does it mean to leave that behind for what it means to be human? Right? That's what the document's asking about. Right? Now, again, I'll remind you once again, you're always, as well as all this, these are the moral coordinates. I just went through a bunch of them. There's more in the text, right? But those are some of the moral coordinates, right? In all of this, right? You're emphasizing it. Okay, wait. How does business contribute to this post-human, transhuman phenomenon? Or how does business contribute to time, space, and family or community, right? I mean, what are the coordinates of the business practices that you're looking at that relate to your case? Okay, all right. So that's the last of the videos. I hope they're helpful. And otherwise, right, your resources are what you find online, the reading of the text, and then obviously I'm going to be giving you plenty of feedback on your writing. Okay, all right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye bye.